Who was Christopher Columbus? A sailor, a dreamer, a man who crossed an ocean and changed the world forever. He didn't discover an empty land. He walked into a world that already lived, breathed, and bled. And what happened next would echo for centuries. Born in 1451 in the bustling port city of Genoa, in what is now Italy, Columbus came of age in a world where maps were riddled with sea monsters and blank spaces. He grew up hearing the stories of merchants, pirates, and adventurers who brought spices, silk, and tales from the far corners of the earth. He was not born into wealth, nor was he from nobility, but he had the sea in his blood and a fire in his mind. As a young man, Columbus worked on merchant ships. He sailed through the Mediterranean, gaining the skills and knowledge that would one day take him far beyond the known world. But it wasn't just sailing that intrigued him, it was navigation, charts, and the mysteries of lands beyond Europe. He devoured everything he could about the geography of the earth, including the theories of ancient Greek and Islamic scholars. While most people clung to the belief that the oceans were dangerous and uncharted, Columbus believed he could reach the riches of Asia not by heading east, but by sailing west across the Atlantic. It was a radical idea. Most scholars believed that the earth was round, yes, but they also believed the ocean between Europe and Asia was far too vast to cross. Columbus, however, underestimated the size of the earth and overestimated the size of Asia. His math was wrong. His maps were flawed, but he believed. And in a world still ruled by religion, tradition, and fear of the unknown, that belief made him dangerous and unforgettable. For years, he tried to gain support for his voyage. He went to Portugal, England, and France. He was laughed at, rejected, and dismissed. But Columbus was relentless. He finally found an audience in Spain, where Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were emerging from centuries of war against the Moors and now looked to expand their empire. In 1492, they agreed to fund Columbus's voyage not because they believed in his vision, but because they hoped it might bring them wealth, power, and influence. On the 3rd of August, 1492, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The journey was treacherous. The ocean was vast and unpredictable. His crew grew anxious and restless, fearing they were sailing into oblivion. But Columbus kept going, guided by a deep conviction that something extraordinary lay ahead. After more than 2 months at sea, on the 12th of October, 1492, they spotted land. Columbus and his men stepped onto an island in the present-day Bahamas. He named it San Salvador. Believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia, he called the native people Indians. But this was not Asia. It was a new world unknown to Europeans, but home to millions of indigenous people who had lived, farmed, hunted, and thrived there for thousands of years. Columbus was greeted by the Taíno people, who welcomed the strangers with curiosity and kindness. But Columbus saw them not just as people but as a resource. In his journals, he described their generosity, their innocence, and their vulnerability, and he wrote of how easily they might be conquered and used for labor. From the very beginning, his voyage was not one of discovery, it was one of conquest. Columbus left some of his men behind on the island and returned to Spain, bringing with him gold, parrots, strange plants, and several captured Taíno. He was hailed as a hero. The Spanish crown celebrated his discovery and granted him a second voyage, this time with 17 ships and over 1,000 men. But he didn't return to explore. He returned to colonize. He came back with weapons, settlers, and the intention to build an empire. And with him came something else, something invisible, but far more deadly: diseases. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly through the native population, who had no immunity. Entire villages were wiped out. In some areas, More than 90% of the indigenous population died within a few decades of contact. Columbus enslaved the Taino, forcing them to mine for gold and work under brutal conditions. Those who resisted were killed. Those who couldn't meet the demands were mutilated or left to die. Within just a few years, the thriving Taino population had begun to collapse under the weight of European brutality, disease, and enslavement. Yet back in Europe, Columbus was still hailed as a man of greatness. He was given titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of the Indies. But as the truth of his rule reached Spain, the cruelty, the chaos, the disobedience of his men, the crown began to question their hero. Eventually, Columbus was arrested and returned to Spain in chains. He had fallen from grace. Stripped of his titles, his legacy now clouded in controversy. He would make one final voyage across the Atlantic, but he would never find the passage to Asia he longed for. He died in 1506, still convinced he had found a new route to the east. But what Columbus had really done was open the door to a new era of European expansion, a door that led to colonization, exploitation, and centuries of transformation that would reshape the Americas forever. Columbus never truly understood the magnitude of what he had done. He had set off seeking riches and glory, dreaming of the courts of the great Khan and cities of gold in the east, but what he stumbled upon was something far more profound. Two worlds colliding, crashing into each other in a violent, irreversible storm. The old world of Europe and the new world of the Americas were no longer separated by myths or oceans. They were now tethered by blood, by conquest, by trade, and by fate. In the years that followed Columbus's first voyage, wave after wave of explorers, soldiers, and settlers came pouring across the Atlantic. The Spanish crown dispatched conquistadors who carved up the Americas in the name of God and empire. Hernán Cortés conquered the mighty Aztec Empire in Mexico. Francisco Pizarro crushed the Incas in Peru. Both used the blueprint that Columbus had laid: arrive, observe, exploit. The indigenous civilizations of the Americas, some of them older and more complex than any European had imagined, were devastated. Entire cultures were wiped out. Sacred temples were destroyed. Gold and silver were looted and shipped back to Europe by the ton. Spain became rich, but at the cost of entire peoples. It all began with Columbus. Even as new expeditions ventured westward, the name of Columbus remained a powerful symbol. For Europeans, he was still the brave sailor who opened the doors to opportunity. His voyages were romanticized in paintings, books, and poems. He became a legend not for what he truly did, but for what people wanted to believe he had done. But history has a way of peeling back the myths. The diaries of Columbus tell a story different from the children's books. His words reveal a man obsessed with gold, obsessed with power, and willing to do anything to achieve it. He described the native people not as equals, but as subjects. He believed it was his God-given right to rule them, convert them, and use them. His legacy, for the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, was not one of discovery but of death. By the early 15s, the island of Hispaniola, where Columbus had established his first colony, had changed beyond recognition. The native Taino population, once in the hundreds of thousands, had plummeted to just a few thousand. Spanish settlers established plantations, introduced African slavery to replace the dying indigenous labor force, and remade the island into a reflection of their empire. The Americas were no longer the lands Columbus had first glimpsed. They were being reshaped, scarred, and claimed. Columbus's sons would fight for years to restore the family name and reclaim the titles and wealth their father had been promised. They believed they were heirs to a glorious legacy. But that legacy was already under scrutiny, even in their own time. Still, the myth endured. In the centuries after his death, Columbus was rebranded again and again. By the time the United States was born in the late 18th century, Americans looked to Columbus as a symbol of boldness and courage, a man who defied the odds to find a new world. Cities were named after him. Statues were raised in his honor. In 1892, on the 400th anniversary of his voyage, President Benjamin Harrison declared Columbus a hero of Western civilization. Schools across the country celebrated Columbus Day, and the Italian-American community, seeking pride and recognition in a land that discriminated against them, embraced Columbus as one of their own. But even as the holiday took root in American culture, so did questions about its truth. Native voices began to rise, challenging the narrative. What was discovery for some had been destruction for others. What was triumph in the textbooks was tragedy on the land. The legacy of Columbus had been split into two Americas, one that celebrated and one that mourned. Today, the conversation around Christopher Columbus is no longer confined to academic circles. Statues are debated and removed. Streets and schools are renamed. In many states, Columbus Day is now Indigenous Peoples Day, a recognition of those who were already here long before Columbus arrived. And yet, the name remains etched in history. Not because he was the first to cross the Atlantic, he wasn't. Not because he found a new land, millions were already living on it. But because he triggered an irreversible moment in the human story. A moment of contact. A moment of conquest. A moment that changed the world forever. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a man flawed, ambitious, relentless. A sailor who took a gamble, crossed an ocean, and set fire to the fuse of history. The world he entered was ancient. The world he left behind was never the same. Centuries later, the waves of the Atlantic still whisper the story of that first crossing. But the echoes have changed. No longer do they speak only of glory, they murmur of sorrow, resistance, and resilience. They carry the voices of peoples who refuse to be forgotten. The Americas that Columbus stumbled upon were not silent lands waiting to be named. They were alive with languages, cultures, cities, and sacred traditions. From the Inca roads winding through the Andes to the longhouses of the Iroquois Confederacy, from the trade networks of the Mississippians to the ceremonies of the Pueblo peoples, the continent thrived with life. Long before Columbus drew his first map, when his sails appeared on the horizon, they did not bring light to darkness. They brought disease, war, and upheaval. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through native communities like wildfires, killing tens of millions in just a few generations. Villages became graveyards. Oral histories became the only memory of a time before. Still, not all would vanish. Native nations fought back. Some resisted on the battlefield. Others survived through adaptation, preserving their heritage in secret, in story, in spirit. The conquest did not erase them, it forced them to evolve. And even as Columbus became a monument of Western achievement, they told a different story, of endurance, of survival, of truth. Columbus himself died in 1506, still convinced he had reached Asia. He never knew the full truth of where he had been. He was buried quietly in Valladolid, Spain, but his remains would be moved multiple times, symbolically shuffled across the Atlantic, just like his legend. At one point, his bones were said to be in the Dominican Republic, later moved to Havana, and then back to Seville. Some claim he's buried in multiple places at once. Even in death, Columbus was caught between two worlds. In the centuries after his passing, the debate around his place in history intensified. Was he a visionary or a villain? A brave explorer or a brutal colonizer? The answer, many argue, is both and neither. He was a reflection of his time, shaped by greed, faith, and ambition. He followed a world order built on conquest and dominion. But what he started sparked revolutions far beyond his understanding. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call it, became one of the most significant events in world history. Crops, animals, cultures, and people flowed between continents. Europe gained tomatoes, potatoes, maize, and chocolate. The Americas were introduced to wheat, cattle, horses, and steel, but also to slavery, guns, and foreign gods. This exchange reshaped the global economy and diet, changed landscapes, and transformed societies forever. But beneath the trade and novelty was a current of violence. African slaves were brought in chains to fuel plantations. Native labor was exploited in mines and fields. Empires rose on the backs of the conquered. The modern world was being born, and it bore the scars of its bloody genesis. Columbus's story is no longer just about a ship on the sea. It's about identity, history, and power. In the 20th and 21st centuries, indigenous activists, scholars, and communities began to reclaim the narrative. They reminded the world that discovery was a one-sided term, that you cannot discover a land that was already home to millions. They asked, not for erasure, but for honesty, for a history that includes all voices. As these conversations grew louder, statues of Columbus began to fall. In cities across the U.S., Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and beyond, his image was removed from pedestals in public parks. Some celebrated, others mourned. Debates broke out across school boards, city councils, and dinner tables. Was this rewriting history, or finally writing it truthfully? Despite the controversy, what remains clear is this: the story of Christopher Columbus is not just about him. It is about the world he changed. It is about the people who lived, died, fought, and endured because of him. It is about what happens when power meets innocence, when ambition meets resistance, and when the pages of history are written with both pride and pain. 5 centuries after his voyage, Columbus still stirs emotions. He's remembered in textbooks and protested in streets. He's painted in murals and challenged in classrooms. His name is spoken with reverence and rage. And in that contradiction lies the truth. Columbus is not just a man, he is a symbol. And symbols, for better or worse, endure. The legacy of that moment in 1492 ripples into our present. The borders of today were shaped by his mistake. The lives of billions carry the consequences of his voyage. And the land he once called India still speaks the languages of those he never meant to find. In the modern world, Columbus's name still sails across streets and cities, across holidays and history books. Columbus Day, once a proud celebration of exploration and Italian-American heritage, has become one of the most contested commemorations in American culture. In its place, many states and cities now observe Indigenous Peoples' Day, an effort to honor those who lived on these lands long before the ships ever appeared on the horizon. But this change is not about erasing history, it's about completing it. To understand Columbus is to confront the collision of two worlds. It's to see the ambition of one man ignite the flames of empire, and to see how that empire altered the fate of continents. It's to walk the beaches where Europeans first stepped ashore and imagine the sound of silence breaking the moment two civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, finally met. That meeting, filled with curiosity, wonder, and violence, forever changed humanity. Columbus never found the riches of Asia, nor did he understand the magnitude of his journey. But what he did find and what followed became the foundation of a new global era. Exploration turned into conquest. Trade turned into colonization. Curiosity gave way to control. The new world was no blank slate. It became a canvas painted with the dreams and nightmares of those who came after. Spain would go on to build a vast colonial empire. The gold and silver from the Americas flooded into European markets. Fortunes were made. Monarchies strengthened. And in the shadows of that wealth, whole civilizations were brought to ruin. The Aztec Empire fell under Hernán Cortés, the Inca under Francisco Pizarro. The land that had once been filled with the thunder of buffalo, the chants of ceremony, and the rhythm of native life was slowly redrawn by foreign hands. Yet the native spirit did not vanish. It persisted in dances held by firelight, in whispered prayers, in the planting of ancient seeds. It lived on in resistance uprisings, revolts, and voices that refused to be silenced. In the Andes, the Quechua language still echoes. In the plains of North America, Lakota children learn the words their grandparents once feared to speak. In the Caribbean, where Columbus first landed, Afro-Indigenous identities rise proudly from centuries of survival. History, like the ocean, moves in tides. For centuries, the tide favored the victors, the colonizers, the conquerors, the chroniclers of their own glory. But now, the tide turns once more. Voices long ignored are being heard. Textbooks are being rewritten. Monuments are being questioned. And Columbus, once a symbol of discovery, now stands as a reminder that every great story has many sides, and the truth lies in all of them. Today, if you walk through Santo Domingo, you'll find a towering lighthouse called the Pharaoh, a colonne built in the shape of a cross, meant to house the remains of Columbus. At night, its beams form a bright, blinding cross in the sky. But for many, it shines not as a beacon of glory, but as a shadow cast over centuries of suffering. And yet, we remember, because remembering is not just about honoring, it's about reckoning. We remember the sailor who crossed the Atlantic not once, but 4 times, who braved storms and mutinies, who believed the world could be reshaped by will alone. We remember the Taino who greeted him with open hands and died by the thousands within years. We remember the dreams that set sail in 1492 and the consequences they unleashed upon the world. Columbus may have opened a new chapter in global history, but it is we today who must decide how that chapter is read, with honesty, with humility, with all its pain, its power, its pride, and its paradox. Because the true legacy of Columbus is not just found in old maps or statues. It is found in the world we now live in, a world born of courage and conquest, of violence and vision, a world shaped by the clash of continents and the meeting of minds, a world where the line between hero and villain is as blurred as the horizon Columbus once chased. And so we return to the question, who was Christopher Columbus? A sailor, a dreamer, a man who crossed an ocean and changed the world forever. He didn't discover an empty land. He walked into a world that already lived, breathed, and bled. And what happened next would echo for centuries. If this story moved you, made you think, or opened your eyes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Was Columbus a hero or a destroyer? Or maybe something in between? Let the world hear your voice.